Hello and welcome to another episode of Latitude, in which we are now going to look at a very important subject where the government of India has begun to lay a lot of emphasis on, and that is economic diplomacy. And with now the Indo-UAE Comprehensive Economic Partnership coming into force formally on the ground, there is need to understand that how these trade agreements, these economic partnerships are going to benefit us, where our shortcomings lie. And I thought we couldn't have had a better guest on the show than the eminent Dr. Sanjay Baru, who, amongst other things, is a geostrategist, a geoeconomist, having been earlier the Secretary General of FICCI. He was also associated with the International Institute of Strategic Studies. More recently now, he's a distinguished fellow at the United Services Institute. He's the author of many best-selling books, was also earlier the editor of a broadsheet, a financial daily. So clearly a man who has an understanding of a variety of issues, having also been the media advisor to former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. So Dr. Baru, welcome on the show once again. Always a delight to have you. And I know you're going to catch me on the wrong foot somewhere, but I'll venture out. So my first question to you is that this comprehensive economic partnership with the UAE, does it really build up incentive for us to go into greater exports? Because the earlier argument was that even when we had such partnerships, we ended up importing more than exporting. So how is this going to benefit the economy? Because some figures that have been announced officially are that India is likely to have lined up an ambitious growth plan of exports of increasing by 20% to UAE to $33 billion. Now, how does that bear out with our overall economic diplomacy strategy?
Well, thank you, Maroof, for having me on your show once again. And this is certainly an important subject for us to be talking about. I think there are two or three very interesting things about the Indo-UAE Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. First and foremost, in my view, it signaled a fundamental change in the thinking about trade and trade diplomacy in the Narendra Modi government. If you recall, they came to power in 2014, very, very critical of the many free trade agreements that the Manmohan Singh government had negotiated. I recall Nirmala Sitharaman, when she was Minister for Trade and Industry, criticizing many of those free trade agreements, including ones with friendly countries like Japan and South Korea, and suggesting that many of them had not benefited us. And towards the end of the first term or the early part of this term, the government of India decided to walk out of the negotiations on the regional comprehensive economic partnership agreement. So overall approach of the Modi government in the first 5-6 years of its term was in fact to take a very negative view of free trade agreements. But recently we've had a spate of agreements. The UAE one was in fact the first major agreement. We've negotiated another one with Australia. And today, this week, the Prime Minister is in Europe. There's a likelihood of a revival of the India-Europe free trade agreement. So overall, I think the fundamental shift in this trade agreement, in our approach towards trade agreements, and the UAE is an important signal of that. Second reason why it is important is that UAE, in fact, is one of our biggest trade partners. It's not often recognized in India that UAE has been for a long time number one or number two trade partner for India. And the third reason is that UAE is not just a trade partner, as you know very well. There are millions of Indians who live in that part of the world, in the Gulf. 4-5 million Indians live there. Every year we get remittances of about $80 billion coming in from there. So for a variety of reasons, the comprehensive nature of our relationship, which is why it's interesting that this agreement is not just called a free trade agreement, it's called a comprehensive economic partnership agreement. We expect to get more investment from the region. We have more Indians working in that region. So there's a lot of synergy between the UAE and India. And I think this agreement was waiting to happen. And I'm delighted that it has.
Okay, great. Linked with that is another aspect, and that is, you mentioned about the regional comprehensive economic partnership that fell through. Apparently, one of the reasons it was the government of India was not willing to push it through beyond a point was because there were outstanding issues and concerns with the Indian domestic market. What were those? Can you explain?
Well, as far as the RCEP is concerned, I think the main factor which forced the government of India to back off was our concern about China. Was our concern of the fact that we continue to have a huge trade deficit vis-a-vis China. I know for a fact that even the previous government, Dr. Manmohan Singh's government, tried to negotiate with the Chinese to bring down the trade deficit. But it's been very, very difficult. And therefore, there was a view in New Delhi, cutting across political parties, that the Chinese had taken far too much advantage of our trade relationship. And therefore, the RCEP will only make that even more pro-China. Also, there was some element of dissatisfaction with the ASEAN countries, which were not willing to look not just at trade agreement, not just at trade in goods, but also link it up with like the UAE, a comprehensive economic partnership agreement, which involved movement of people, movement of services. And so I think overall we took the view that this was not going to serve our interests.
Okay, so talking of China, there are indirect references in various assumptions that have come out post the COVID pandemic that the over-dependence on certain centers of supplies or the supply chain where it emanates from and the over-dependence there has its limitations for free trade globally, though it may be advantageous to have products coming out of China which are meeting international standards and were price competitive. But likewise, there was a fear that would China be able to hold the world's economies to ransom because of the overdependence and therefore the need to create other options? And would that have energized us into more free trade arrangements with other countries?
I think so. I think the fact that the RCEP didn't go through and that we are out of this major regional trade agreement, which is Asia-wide. I mean, after all, the RCEP includes Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and ASEAN, along with China. It's one of the most dynamic, economic regions in the world. And the fact that for geopolitical reasons, we opted out of this regional economic grouping, I think forced us to rethink our approach to other free trade agreements. And we started looking at different countries. For example, as I said earlier, we negotiated an FTA with Australia, which also is, in a sense, a comprehensive agreement. It has, apart from trade in goods, also clauses on trade in services and movement of people. And we are looking at similar agreements with Canada and the United Kingdom. So I think there is definitely a new approach towards trade policy. It's very interesting that the former secretary, currently, Mr. B.V.R. Subramaniam, was an important functionary in the Prime Minister's office in 2004, 2008, when I was also there, when Dr. Manmohan Singh set up what was called the Trade and Economic Relations Committee, TERC, which tried to combine foreign policy with trade policy. Since we are talking about economic diplomacy, it took a comprehensive view of our relations with the world. And Subramaniam was someone who was very actively associated with that. He's himself, apart from being an IAS officer, a trade policy expert. So I'm not surprised at this level of activism on the trade front ever since he became Commerce Secretary.
Okay, so we'll come back after break to look at one or two other things, that what has held us back other than the political calculations, but also there are some inherent shortages at our end and shortcomings at our end, like infrastructure. But we'll talk after break to see where we need to speed up on that front. Welcome back. We are looking at India's free trade initiatives and the recent start of the Comprehensive Economic Partnership between India and the UAE, which is now formally gotten underway, and how this could set the stage for many such initiatives between India, its neighborhood, and its extended neighborhood, particularly in Europe and as far away as Australia. These arrangements are in place. They need to now push through much more aggressively. And we have Dr. Baru still with us. Dr. Baru, sir, there is a view that India's existing free trade agreements, most of which were inked in the mid-2000s, and when you were a player in the government, they have seen more imports grow than exports. So some figures, and you must be more familiar with them, that in the decade between FY11 and FY21, that's a 10-year period, it is said that exports to 9 countries and 2 trading blocs from India had trade agreements that grew 36% to top $62 billion. And this was exports there, whereas imports from there grew 44%, and they were touching $75 billion and figures like that. I don't want to confuse the audience with too many figures, but broad question is that these free trade agreements were really being used to fill up the Indian markets with fancier products, in as much as now there seems to be a desire to push Indian products into other markets, particularly the UAE, and from there into Africa and perhaps even parts of Southern Europe. Your views?
Well, this addresses a very fundamental problem, which is the lack of adequate competitiveness. I mean, we can blame China for having non-transparent policies, because of which China runs a huge trade deficit vis-a-vis India. But other countries like Japan or Korea, with whom we had FTAs, their policies are not non-transparent. The fact is that the Indian thirst for technology, for manufactured goods, for capital goods from countries like Japan and Korea is far more than their demand for a range of Indian goods. Now, part of the reason, of course, may be bias. For example, when it comes to agricultural products, there is a very strong bias against Indian exports because of questions about phytosanitary conditions, questions about use of fertilizer in Indian agriculture, etc., etc. But basic problem as far as manufacturing exports are concerned has been lack of scale, lack of competitiveness. So to blame the trade agreement rather than look inward at the level of competitiveness of our manufacturing capacity, I think is putting the cart before the horse. And for a long time, Indian business organizations like CII and FICCI have been constantly demanding what they call level playing field, that to improve the domestic ease of business, the quality of our infrastructure, the competence of manufacturing capacity, etc. And so I think addressing this domestic problem or domestic constraints is a real problem for us, is a real solution, rather than simply blame the free trade agreement.
Fair enough. In fact, even experts have noted that the key cause behind India not being able to benefit from its arrangement with trading partners has been the lack of competitiveness in the Indian industry. But there's another problem area, sir, and that is infrastructural shortcomings. Like, for example, geography. gives us access to markets, whether in the subcontinent, from the near neighborhood to the extended neighborhood. And we also have a lot of other demographic benefits, manpower, and the ability to manufacture things in the right quantities if opportunities are provided. But look at China. It doesn't have that contiguity to South Asia or even Southeast Asia as we have, or perhaps we have equal contiguity to Southeast Asia as them. But look at China and the Middle East. China is everywhere. So China has improved its infrastructure, it's improved the quality of its products. So what would you say are really immediate and thereafter the near immediate checklist items that we should address if we really want to take advantage of certain free trade agreements?
I think there are two fundamental, policy challenges that we need to tackle. First and foremost is the problem of labor productivity. The Chinese manufacturing sector has much higher, has had for a long time, a higher labor productivity ratio. And therefore improving the productivity of labor is extremely important. We just mentioned about India having a lot of labor, but quantity is not enough. It's the quality that we need to focus on. And wherever sectors where labor productivity has improved or is improving, we do see an improvement in our exports. So it's not as if our export story is all negative. There are many pockets of excellence, many pockets of competitiveness, and we are in fact increasing more and more our manufacturing exports. But the second challenge is scale. The Chinese produce a lot of products on scale. Now, part of the reason for scale, of course, is their entire approach to exports has been to make export the engine of growth. While we have not, by and large, looked at exports as an engine of growth, even with this government, it came in with what was called Make in India, as if India was the only market for which you should make. And it has changed that slogan to Make in India and Make for the World. There was a revision of that slogan. And I think that's the correct approach to take. Make in India, but make for the world. And when you make for the world, you make at scale. And that is an important lesson we have learned from the Chinese experience, that you need to have much higher scale and much higher labor productivity. Once these two challenges are addressed, I do think Indian exports will do well.
Okay, wonderful. Last but not the least, could you explain to us that why is it that countries are now coming into India with such frequency, and India seems to be now attracting everybody from all over, from Europe to Australia, and of course, United States has been very keen to engage with India more and more. What is it that they see now in India that they hadn't seen pre-pandemic, let's put it that way?
It's not what they see in India. It's what they see next to India that is make all the difference. I think we need to thank China and the policies of President Xi Jinping for forcing the rest of the world to look more at India. The fact is that the entire West, Europe included, was so fascinated by China that they increased their dependence on China. And it took this excessive dependence and the negative consequence of the dependence to force the West to look at India. I remember going to Germany last year and talking to the German intellectuals about greater Indo-German relations. But all of them would say, oh, but BMW sells more in Germany, Volkswagen sells more in Germany. So what they could sell in Germany blinded them to the opportunities in India. But the fact that now the West has a major geopolitical problem with China is forcing it to decouple. They use the word decouple, but frankly, in my judgment, they have not been able to decouple. What they're essentially doing is de-risking. I think it's important to understand that. It'll take a long time before the West can decouple from China, but they're certainly de-risking from China. And initial beneficiaries of that have been other countries in Asia like Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, or even Bangladesh. But India finally is beginning to benefit as more and more Western companies are willing to sell.
But very true, sir. Thank you very much for your views. In fact, I mean, I'm a hard-nosed realist, and I believe that had it not been for the Chinese intrusions in Ladakh, we would have not woken up to the China threat. Had it not been for the pandemic, the West would not have looked at the need for new supply chains to be created and new centers for economic engagement. And had it not been for the Russian intrusions and invasion of Ukraine, the West and Europe would not have woken up to their need to give a little more money to defense and security, because everything has a price that you have to pay. So thank you very much. And I hope our viewers have learned as much as I have from your wisdom, and hope to have you some other day on the show. Until then, goodbye.